Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. UCP House Leader Joseph Scow says public safety is a big priority for the province as the budget is about to be rolled out late Thursday. We hear from our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson, who explains why Alberta is opting out of the National Pharmacare program. And Ag Expo continues at the Agri-Food Hub and Trade Centre. We hear how drone technology has become a real focal point for our farmers.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. The Alberta Legislature reconvened for the spring session today. Now, government officials say the focus will be geared toward protecting Albertans and building a more prosperous future. UCP House Leader Joseph Scow says his party has heard from Albertans who are concerned for their safety in many regions of the province.
So we have heard from Albertans that public safety is a top priority. And I have to give a lot of credit to the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Services, Mike Ellis, for his tireless work getting in the communities and better understanding the needs of Albertans. He has worked to advance the province's fight against violent crimes and has truly been a leader in addressing these. And so I believe you can expect to see legislation regarding public safety because it's our job as a province to protect Albertans where it matters most, at home and in the streets.
The renewable energy moratorium is coming to an end here in Alberta. It was originally put on the back burner 7 months ago so government officials could study the impact of solar and wind farms on our land when it comes to agriculture. Affordability and Utilities Minister Nathan Neudorf says the bottom line is that agriculture comes first.
Agriculture is at the heart of Alberta, playing a significant role in our heritage, economy, and our way of life. Our native grasslands are something that farmers and ranchers have conserved since before we became a province and are deeply connected to Alberta's First Nations. These, along with Alberta's vast irrigation networks and other agricultural lands, play an invaluable role in putting affordable, high-quality food on tables around the world. To support the Agriculture First approach, we will begin taking steps to make sure that the value and importance of agricultural land is taken into account when developing new renewable projects.
Premier Daniel Smith recently met with leaders of the Treaty 6 First Nations about renewing their relationship with the Alberta government. Enoch Grand Chief Cody Thomas says it's very important to keep building that relationship with the province, which will in turn help develop future collaboration on a wide range of projects.
Our agreement is sacred, both to the Confederacy of Treaty Number 6 First Nations and the Government of Alberta. Have recognized that First Nations treaty rights are protected by Section 35 of the Constitution Act. The Government of Alberta has recognized the Crown's treaty relationship with First Nations. The GOA has also recognized its duty to consult Treaty Number 6 First Nations. This agreement also establishes mechanisms for First Nations and the GOA to determine joint strategies to address priorities.
As you've heard here on Bridge City News, the federal government will be rolling out the National Pharmacare program. It'll include contraceptives and certain diabetes drugs, including insulin, being covered. Now, according to our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson, Alberta will not be taking part.
Biggest reason is sort of a philosophical one. If we go back to May 2020, there was the Fair Deal Panel report, and that obviously recommended the Alberta Pension Plan and Alberta Provincial Police Force, the equalization referendum. One of the things it also recommended, which did not get as much attention at the time and has not gotten as much attention since, is that it also recommended not participating in cost-sharing programs with the federal government, but instead trying to get that money. And so that's basically what Adriana LaGrange has said the Alberta government is going to seek. She said, we have our own sort of pharmacare plan, which is true. There is a pharmacare plan in Alberta for lower income people, for people under the age of 18, things like that. And so she wants that money, that per capita funding, to go towards that program instead of being a part of, a national pharmacare scheme.
Mr. Dawson will also discuss what we could potentially expect in the new budget to be announced on Thursday. He'll have details coming up after business news. The UCP is demanding that the president of the Alberta Federation of Labour step down immediately. Party officials say Gil McGowan, who is seeking the NDP leadership, should, quote, not use union dues as a slush fund for political ambitions. UCP MLA Shane Getson says Alberta's workers deserve a president focused on them and not on political games. McGowan told a local blogger that he plans on seeking the leadership to replace Rachel Notley in June. That would be 4 candidates who put their names forward so far, the others being Calgary MLA Kathleen Ganley and Edmonton MLAs Sarah Hoffman and Raki Pancholi. A man is dead following an altercation at the Drumheller prison on Monday. Police say they received a call about a medical emergency at the institution around 5 p.m. When they arrived, they found a 34-year-old man with serious injuries. The investigation revealed that he was in an altercation inside of the jail with another inmate. The man was taken to hospital where he later died. RCMP Major Crimes Division has taken over the investigation. Police are asking anyone who may have information about this crime to call Crime Stoppers right away. This is Pink Shirt Day, a day Albertans and Canadians wear pink to stand against bullying in all forms. It began in 2007 when 2 grade 12 students, David Shepard and Travis Price in Nova Scotia, bought and distributed 50 pink shirts after grade 9 student Chuck McNeil was bullied for wearing a pink polo shirt. Pink Shirt Day is now recognized not only here in Canada, but also in New Zealand. The event often coincides with Anti-Bullying Day. Jeanette Rocher is out with her pink shirt in an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, the meltdown has begun here in southwestern Alberta. Very sloppy outside. It may be a good time to maybe load up on more of that windshield washer fluid.
Yeah, it is so lovely out there today, especially after that deep freeze we were in yesterday. And yeah, wiper fluid could be essential considering the mild temperatures that we are in for. That's going to remain and get even nicer tomorrow. And remember earlier this week I mentioned there's a double-digit day coming at us on Thursday. There it is right there. We're looking at a high of 10 degrees tomorrow. And of course, where the warmer temperatures are, there are also Chinook winds present. So both this evening and into tomorrow, we're looking at winds up to 60 kilometers per hour. And then after that, we could see the temperature dip a little bit for the weekend. I'll be back later in the show to give you that forecast. Hal?
Looking forward to it. Thanks so much, Jeanette. Well, it is day 2 of the Ag Expo taking place at the Lethbridge Agri-Food Hub and Trade Center. There are around 300 exhibitors participating. Organizers say the event is business-focused, where farmers can network and purchase various products and services. They say events like Ag Expo are vital to help feed a thriving agricultural community, including incorporating the technology of drones to help farmers.
It's not like it was 50 years ago. There's so much technology involved now. And like you mentioned, drones are a big growth area. And what you're able to do then is, producers and farmers are able to see the entire field through a drone's eyes. And they can get out there and the drones can do water application, they can do fertilizer application, weed spraying, but they can do it in ways that are efficient and sustainable, that they're not overusing resources. They can figure out what parts of the field need more love in terms of fertilizer or need some weed spraying, and they can really isolate where they're going into. And the farmer doesn't need to be out there driving around in a truck. They have the tablet in front of them and they're able to see their field. So the innovation, the world of technology has obviously advanced so far, and it's really being seen now in the ag industry and how advanced it's becoming.
The Ag Expo continues until 5 p.m. on Thursday. Tickets are $20 at the door, but free for those 11 and under or for those taking agriculture-based programs at either Lethbridge College or the U of L. Some of the players and coaching staff with the Lethbridge Hurricanes Hockey Club are doing their part and giving back to the community in a very special way. They've been serving up meals at the Lethbridge Soup Kitchen and are there again tonight until 8 o'clock. Canes defenseman Noah Chadwick explains why it means so much to him to help serve our community in this giving way.
It's an honor and it's a privilege, to be where we are and to be able to be a face in the community and to be able to support other people in Lethbridge and it gives us a little bit of perspective and I think it just gives us a little more gratitude to be here every day and playing hockey and having this privileged life. So it means a lot for me personally to be able to do that and for the whole team.
Samaritan's Purse has been busy helping out in Israel. The Christian organization has been shipping kits with medical supplies for treating life-threatening wounds as the war between Israel and Hamas rages on. As we hear in this next report, they've been trying their best to try and save as many lives as possible.
After the 7 October attacks, where Hamas attacked communities, We saw a need for advanced trauma life support kits where doctors and nurses could be able to use these bags to save lives and stabilize patients on the ground while ambulances came to take them to hospitals. We had 1,000 advanced trauma life support kits put together and delivered to our warehouse, and from there they were transported to the airfield to be airlifted to Israel.
My name is Uri Shacham. I'm the Chief of Staff for Magen David Adom, Israel's national emergency medical and blood services. The bags has arrived a couple of days ago. Immediately when they cleared customs, they were taken to Magen David Adom warehouse where they are going to be shipped and delivered for doctors and paramedics in communities all around Israel. Prior of receiving this ATLS bag, a doctor or a paramedic will have to undergo a special and dedicated training in which they'll have to function as the immediate responder on the field.
My name is Dr. Hadar Miloraz. I'm an endocrinologist here in the Sheba Medical Center, where we are. So we really put a lot of thought and a lot of effort into trying to understand what will make this difference between life and death. We assembled a list of approximately 70 items, different items, according to the ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation, that make up life-saving equipment that can actually save more than one life. The doctor or the paramedic can just put it on his or her back and run to the scene and then save lives.
Thank you for this vision.
This is a dream come true. Now we're well equipped, thanks to you.
My name is Marganit Sasson. I'm an emergency physician in Israel. Today I received a trauma bag, ATLS bag, which is an amazing bag stuffed with a lot of equipment that I can use while treating an emergency. When we talk about trauma, life and death, the difference between life and death could be minutes. This is why it is so important to have the equipment right beside us, right in the community, to grab it and run to the place where it happened. I'm one of hundreds of physicians and medics that are going to have these bags and take them back to their communities. It could be in their house, could be in their neighborhood, could be in there next to the kindergarten. If someone needs it, they will be able to help people and save lives.
Families of hostages being held in Gaza, along with their supporters, launched a 4-day march from southern Israel to Jerusalem. They're demanding that their loved ones be released by the terrorist group Hamas.
No one can be left behind, the living and the murdered. The War Cabinet is responsible for ensuring that the current deal, all the hostages will be included. We cannot agree to leave any sector behind. No one should be left behind.
Well, this is nearing the end of Black History Month. Now, did you know there was a Canadian baseball team in the 1930s called the Chatham Colored All-Stars? Now, this team broke down a lot of racial barriers in the sport early on. Miriam Wright wrote a book on the team called Sporting Justice. She says the squad faced a lot of adversity in the beginning, including having stones thrown at them.
Just day-to-day racism they faced when they were playing. They experienced, people throwing rocks at them, hurling racial slurs at them. They would, when they traveled, it was difficult because they didn't know if they would be able to find a place to eat, whether a restaurant would serve them. They got turned away from hotels, even during their final championship tournament with the Penetanguishene team. And so this was a big barrier. Other barriers included like finances, money. They didn't have any major sponsors and they had to scrounge to get people to, help them even buy their uniforms.
Make sure you catch the full interview with author and associate professor of history at the University of Windsor, Miriam Wright, and myself coming up later in our broadcast. Well, it was nice to be on the plus side of things again. Weather-wise today in Lethbridge, things are pretty slushy and slippery, however. The temperatures and the warm temperatures will only be here for the short term. Full weather details are coming up. A lot of the ice and roads have turned into slush, and it's quite messy here in Lethbridge right now. Jeanette Rocher is in wearing her pink for Pink Shirt Day and has all of the weather details. Jeanette, the mild temperatures we've seen lately may only last with us for the next day or so before the mercury drops again?
Yeah, so true. Enjoy it while you can, especially tomorrow as we see that double-digit day. Thursday, looking at lots of sunshine, and then we're going to see the clouds roll in again before the weekend. Mix of sun and cloud on Friday. -5 for a high puts us back in the seasonal range. Then we're going to see that dip back to -13. Going to be a chilly weekend for us, unfortunately, seeing some flurries on Saturday. Mix of sun and cloud Sunday, high of only -12. And then as we get into the work week next week, Monday, 0 for a high, and then we're back in the pluses again on Tuesday. So we're seeing just that little dip in temperature, that cold front coming in for the weekend. Average high for this time of year, 3 degrees. Average low, -9. 19 was our high temperature that happened back in 1992. And the cold record was happening back in 62. And it was -32. Very chilly for this time of year. 7:17, that's when the sun rose this morning. Here's some good news for us here. 6:12 is when the sun set this evening, and we're looking at so close to 11 hours of daylight now. Looking at 10 hours, 55 minutes of sunlight. I love that. Okay, 8 degrees for a high expected tomorrow in Victoria, 30% chance of showers, 30-50 winds, seeing a risk of a thunderstorm as well. 6 degrees for a high tomorrow in Vancouver, and 60% chance of showers. Could see a risk of a thunderstorm there as well. -5, the expected high tomorrow in Edmonton. Edmonton could see some periods of afternoon flurries and also periods of light snow as well expected tomorrow in Calgary. High of 10 degrees, but I have to mention that when that snow starts to fall, the temperature could drop again as well from that daytime high, and looking at very cold wind chill values as well, down to -17 in Calgary tomorrow. So 6 for a high expected tomorrow in Saskatoon, mix of sun and cloud, 30-50 winds, clearing skies in Regina tomorrow, 7 up to 50 winds there as well. -5 for a high in Winnipeg. Winnipeg could see a 30% chance of flurries and up to 50 winds, and we're seeing that trend continue in Toronto, up to 50 winds, 40% chance of flurries, high of 0 though. -7 for a high. Now, Ottawa and Montreal are seeing a warning for flash freezing tonight, which means that a cold front is moving into the area, and a very short amount of time that temperature could drop right down. But tomorrow we are seeing mainly sunny skies in Ottawa and a mix of sun and cloud in Montreal, high of 8 there. As we get into the Atlantic portion of the country, this is where we're seeing a lot of precipitation and a lot of warnings are in effect. So we're seeing a wind warning and a rainfall warning in all of these areas. Fredericton seeing that warning tonight, but by tomorrow seeing 2 centimeters of snowfall, -3 for a high, could see some showers as well. Halifax looking at a high of 7 degrees, up to 100 winds tomorrow, 10 to 15 millimeters of rain, changing to some snow. And in Charlottetown tomorrow, 7 degrees for a high, also seeing a wind warning up to 90 winds, and seeing rainfall up to 10 millimeters, could see 2 centimeters of snow as well. So we're seeing all kinds of stuff happening. Also risk of thunder showers for both Halifax and Charlottetown tomorrow. St. John seeing 2 millimeters of drizzle tomorrow with a high of 6 degrees. So lots going on. There you have it. That is your weather.
The Parliamentary Budget Officer says the Defense Department is planning unprecedented capital spending in the coming years. Yves Giroux has found that the spending is set to be at least $10 billion a year. It's expected to peak by the year 2027 at $18 billion. Giroux also says there have been delays in military procurements, but pushing spending into later years raises concerns that inflation will reduce the government's purchasing power. Our province's 7-month pause in the wind and solar development is coming to an end on Thursday. Some in the renewable energy sector are concerned about the growing trend of politicizing energy. Greengate Power helped to develop Travers Solar Farm in southern Alberta, one of the largest solar projects in the world. Company officials say they're holding off on future projects in the province until it can be certain that renewable energy will be treated fairly. They say the Alberta government singled out the renewable energy sector by temporarily shutting down development in order to formulate new rules. Government officials have said that the moratorium was put in place to study renewables' impact on our agriculture sector. Wendy's has clarified that it has no plans to raise prices at many of its North American restaurants. Media outlets recently reported that the company was looking to test having the prices of its menu items fluctuate throughout the day based on demand. The burger chain says it never used the phrase surge pricing and does not plan on implementing that practice. Company officials say instead, its digital menu boards could let them change menu offerings at different times of the day and offer discounts to customers more easily, particularly in the slower times of the day. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 75 points on the day to finish at 21,243. The Dow was down 23 points to 38,949. The S&P 500 was down 8 on the day to 5,069, and the Nasdaq was down 87 points to 15,947. West Texas Intermediate Oil was down 60 cents to 78.27 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 6 cents to $1.87 US. Gold was up 4.06 on the day to $2,034.55 US an ounce, and silver was even at $22.46 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.16 per bushel, barley's at $5.98, canola's at $13.40, and corn is at $7.39 per bushel. Live cattle were down 95 cents to $184.65. Feeder cattle March contract was down $3.40 to $249.60, and lean hogs April contract was up a dime to $86. The Canadian dollar was down slightly over the past 24 hours to 73.64 US. Recapping one of our top stories, the UCP is demanding that the president of the Alberta Federation of Labour step down immediately. Party officials say Gil McGowan, who is seeking the NDP leadership, should not use union dues as a, quote, slush fund for political ambitions. UCP MLA Shane Getson says Alberta's workers deserve a president focused on them and not on political games. McGowan told a local blogger that he plans on seeking the leadership to replace Rachel Notley in June. Well, the Alberta budget is set to be released on Thursday. Apparently, it may look a little lean. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will have details of what it could look like momentarily. Listen, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. Also, be sure to visit our new careers section on our website and check out the jobs that we have posted. We're doing some hiring right now. The UCP is set to release its budget on Thursday afternoon. Now, so far, we don't know a lot about it other than it may look a little lean. It won't go into a deficit, but a surplus of around $1 billion is anticipated. Now, to chat about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, with oil prices being below $80 US per barrel for quite some time now, how much of that is maybe playing a role?
Well, probably quite a bit. When Danielle Smith has spoken recently, she's talked about how without resource revenues, there's something like a $16 billion sort of shortfall in Alberta's, sort of overall financial structure. So this year, certainly we're looking at resource revenues that are quite a bit lower than were anticipated. If you look at the last fiscal update, for example, which was at the end of November 2023, I think they'd projected about a $5.5 billion surplus, and now we're looking probably in the range of $1 billion. So this is quite a big change from a year ago when things were looking really good. Royalty revenues were sort of flowing in. And so it's certainly not going to be as big spending a budget or perhaps with as large a surplus as had been anticipated. And of course, it doesn't sound like there's going to be any major cuts from what we're hearing, but it does seem like the budget is perhaps not going to grow to the extent that some people might have wanted. And one of the sort of big outstanding questions that we're sort of thinking about going into Thursday's budget drop is, how far does that $1 billion surplus go? We have this reorganization of Alberta Health Services. Presumably that's going to cost money. We have wildfire season is coming up, and that obviously also costs money. So what if there's an emergency? What if there's a fire? What if there's a flood? It's a pretty tight budget. And so you have to wonder what some of the bureaucrats in finance are thinking, if something unexpected comes up, which I think is fair to say has been the case in recent years with flooding and fires and all manner of catastrophe.
Now, when Premier Smith addressed the province recently, there were a couple of big takeaways. One is that there would not be an income tax cut, and the other was a plan to grow the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Now, Smith says she doesn't want to put all of our investment bags into the energy basket.
Yeah, that's right. So it's similar to what we just talked about in terms of this gap in funding from, we've got personal income tax, we've got various user fees, corporate taxes that make up the sort of budget mix, but the royalty revenues from non-renewable resources are a really, really big part of that pie. And, Rachel Notley used to call it the resource roller coaster. Danielle Smith has used similar language. Pretty much every premier for the past 40 years has talked in some way about this sort of up and down of the royalty revenue scheme, I guess. And so Danielle Smith has sort of talked about this, saying, look, we need to be thinking about the future. What are we going to do in terms of funding the province's obligations when and if these revenues start to dry up or substantially slow down? So this is sort of relevant to both of the points you just raised. I mean, the first is that during the May 2023 election, the United Conservatives had promised an income tax cut that was going to create a new bracket of an 8% income tax on earnings under $60,000. And that would have saved every person, every family, several $100s in tax money this year, which obviously could go towards tackling inflation, buying groceries, paying your energy bill, all those sorts of things. And Danielle Smith says, look, we just can't afford it at this point. So it does seem to still be coming. I think the safe bet there is that's probably a pre-election promise in a few years' time, or pre-election tax cut. But that's not happening tomorrow. The other thing is the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Now, the pitch that Danielle Smith has made is basically, look, if we had a humongous Heritage Savings Trust Fund, if it was worth between $250 to $400 billion, we wouldn't even need royalty revenues. The interest earned each year on that fund would paper over that gap. And, if you look at the history of the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, it probably could be about that big. Back in 1976, Peter Lougheed put, I think it was an initial investment of $12 billion into the fund. Now, about almost 40 years later, it's $21 billion. So that's not a lot of growth in 40 years. And part of the reason for that is nobody put any money into it between about 1986 and 2006. The interest was scraped off to pay for the budget and things like that. So we have no idea what Danielle Smith's plan to grow the trust fund is. She does say that there's going to be a plan coming out later this year, perhaps in the fall, with sort of a roadmap leading up to 2050, where this $250 to $400 billion number could be achieved. Pretty hard to imagine how that could be done going into a really, really tight budget on Thursday. But that does seem to be their sort of long-term fiscal plan is, look, if we were smarter with this money, if we had been smarter with this money, then we wouldn't have this resource roller coaster that budget makers are tackling every single year.
Could the province potentially use some of the money from the Heritage Savings Trust Fund to deal with some contingencies, some emergencies that may crop up?
They could. In theory, money can be, as far as I understand, can be taken out sort of at any point and it goes into general revenues. And, part of the reason for the trust fund was to help fund economic diversification, to improve quality of life of Albertans, things like that. So it does sort of fit within the original mandate of the trust fund, I would say, to be able to do that. They could also run a slight deficit. They could maybe get lucky. Maybe oil goes up when the Trans Mountain Pipeline opens, something like that. Revenues flow in. So there are, some ways that could be not that much of a problem. And, I think perhaps we're all just hoping that there won't be a catastrophe this year that we'll need a bunch of money thrown at it.
Tyler, earlier this week, Premier Danielle Smith denounced one of her most vocal supporters in David Parker with Take Back Alberta. What happened there?
Well, so David Parker in the last couple weeks has leveraged a few very personal attacks at some sort of major political figures in Alberta and Canada. He attacked Naheed Nenshi, the former Calgary mayor. He attacked Sarah Hoffman, a wannabe leader of the Alberta New Democrats. Attacked both of their appearances in quite an unpleasant fashion. And then on last Friday, I guess it would have been, he'd gone after Pierre Poilievre and his wife. And these were, unusual vitriolic attacks, certainly raised a lot of eyebrows among political watchers. And my colleague Don Braid at the Calgary Herald had written a couple columns about it and had asked, when is Smith going to denounce Parker? She did that on Tuesday evening in a press conference, said that this is not the sort of thing she wants to be affiliated with. She said that she had spoken to David Parker and said he should, delete his Twitter and get some help and things like that. So there is, I think, a public understanding, or a public belief, I should say, that David Parker is a lot closer to the government than perhaps he is, that he wields a lot more influence than perhaps he does. He's not as influential as people think. However, he does have relatively close ties to this government. He's, as you mentioned, a very prominent backer of Danielle Smith. Danielle Smith was at his wedding. So there are some connections there, and Smith did take the move this week to sort of disavow those connections and condemn some of what Parker's been up to.
The renewables moratorium ends on Thursday. Now, this was a 7-month-long delay in approval of renewable energy projects. The pause was meant to give the province more time to develop policies around where projects could be built and potentially protect farmland. So, Tyler, did the province really meet their objective here?
They seem to have. The controversy that's going to come out of this is really what that will do to the renewable sector. So to back up a second, as you said, the rules are basically going to say, look, you can't put up a windmill or a biomass facility or something on prime agricultural land unless there's a way for animals and crops to sort of prosper around it. And there will be rules around having these facilities on what the government's calling a pristine viewscape. So, whatever that might mean in terms of the government's definition of it, presumably lovely vistas of the Rocky Mountains and things like that. So that part of it is sort of set out. I think that's probably what was broadly expected from this. The issue that the renewable energy sector is concerned about is how is this going to affect their development? Are they going to be able to find land? To what extent are they going to be able to enter agreements with landowners without government interference? And really, because it's a booming sector in Alberta. I think Alberta is the #1 destination in the country for renewable energy investment. And so the concern from the sector is that these rules, however much sense they might make, are they going to put a damper on what's really a growing area and aspect of the Alberta economy. And the other thing I should just mention on that is there's also going to be rules around sort of end-of-life cycle reclamation and cleanup, which of course we've seen is a huge issue with the oil and gas sector, with orphan wells and things like that. So the government, I think, is trying to head off having another issue like that down the road.
Ottawa recently announced a national pharmacare program where contraceptives and various diabetes drugs, including insulin, would be made available. Tyler, our health minister here in the province, Adriana LaGrange, says Alberta is not participating, not taking part. Why is that?
Well, part of the reason, I think maybe the biggest reason is sort of a philosophical one. If we go back to May 2020, there was the Fair Deal Panel report, and that obviously recommended the Alberta Pension Plan and Alberta Provincial Police Force, the equalization referendum. One of the things it also recommended, which did not get as much attention at the time and has not gotten as much attention since, is that it also recommended not participating in cost-sharing programs with the federal government, but instead trying to get that money. And so that's basically what Adriana LaGrange has said the Alberta government is going to seek. She said, we have our own sort of pharmacare plan, which is true. There is a pharmacare plan in Alberta for lower income people, for people under the age of 18, things like that. And so she wants that money, that per capita funding, to go towards that program instead of being a part of a national pharmacare scheme. And it is true that most Albertans do have pharmacy coverage of some sort already. It's about 75%. Only about a quarter of Albertans do not have private or private insurance or are participating in the Alberta government program. But it's going to be very, very controversial politically. I mean, I think Albertans are going to be scratching their heads about wondering, why shouldn't I get my drugs covered? Certainly the NDP is going to go all in on this, and the federal government as well has sort of said, well, you guys haven't even seen the plan yet, so why are you rejecting it? So I certainly think we're going to hear quite a bit more about this in the months ahead.
Forestry Minister Todd Loewen recently announced that the official wildfire season is beginning about 10 days earlier than usual. Tyler, even though it's winter and we have a bit of snow on the ground, there's still dozens of fires burning across the province.
Yeah, the last time I checked, I think it was about 55 fires. Now, none of these are sort of catastrophically humongous fires, but some of them are still burning from last year, which is part of the concern. And this sort of does bring us full circle to what we talked about at the beginning. How is this going to be paid for? Is there going to be enough money set aside? So on and so forth. So wildfire season was officially supposed to begin on March 1st. That's Friday. And it's not. It began last Wednesday, I think. And that's basically just a signal that the government is taking this seriously, that they are concerned about the fire season this year. And so one of the things to look for in the budget tomorrow is probably going to be, what does wildfire preparedness look like? Minister Loewen had said he's asked for funding for an additional 100 firefighters this year to bring the whole crew strength up to about 1,000. So that'll be something else to watch for. And, it's the case with me, and I'm sure it's the case with you and lots of our viewers, that People are trying to make summer plans and planning on hiking and camping and wondering whether or not they're going to get smoked out. So I think this is one of those things that the government is concerned about, but this is, I think, also very much something that people are talking about around the kitchen table and things like that when they're looking at, what are farmland conditions going to be looking like? What is the fire situation going to be and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's a very, very big issue in addition to all the other stuff going on.
Tyler, there's been some discussion of adding political parties to our province's municipal electoral scene. Now, Premier Danielle Smith says she's in favor, saying she'd like to see them in some of the larger centres. But Albertans, however, according to a recent poll, are not in favor. What would it actually look like?
Well, it would basically look, it's not a great answer, but it would basically look like what they have in Montreal and Vancouver, where there are party systems and councillors are affiliated with one sort of party or another. Now, of course, municipal politics it's sort of already broken down a little bit by party or at least political affiliation. You can tell often which councillors are the more progressive councillors, which councillors are the more conservative councillors. And so Danielle Smith says that's already the case. All this would do is put a label on it, and she argues that that would increase transparency. But as you say, the government did polling on this that the Edmonton Journal reported on, and basically people don't want it. They said about 70% of Albertans said they reject this, and about 60-odd% sort of strongly rejected the idea. So it's a bit of an overwhelming consensus, I would say, from Albertans that this is not something they want in their political system. And you look at the behavior in question period, whether that's at the provincial level or the federal level, and you do have to wonder if that's the sort of thing people want to see from their city halls. Now, if it does happen, it does seem like it would probably happen to the larger centers, Edmonton, Calgary, maybe Red Deer, maybe Lethbridge, maybe Medicine Hat, maybe Grand Prairie, but it's hard to imagine that Ponoka is going to end up with political parties at their municipal government level. But we'll have to see. The legislation, if it happens, should be coming this spring, and that will certainly give us a better sense of where the government intends to go with this.
One of the candidates vying to replace Rachel Notley in June as leader of the Alberta NDP wants to see minimum wage go up here in the province. Calgary MLA Kathleen Ganley says the $15 an hour that's been in place, I think, since 2018 should go up, at least $1 an hour?
Yeah, and actually, I was doing some research on this a little bit earlier, and Alberta's minimum wage sort of by the end of 2024 will, along with Saskatchewan, actually be the lowest in the country. Most other ones are having bumps at some point this year, or they're pegged to inflation. And so that's sort of what Kathleen Ganley is arguing. She's saying that it should go up by about $1 a year for a couple years, 2 or 3 years. And then after that should be pegged to inflation. So, if inflation's 2% or whatever, minimum wage goes up by 2% each year. This is fairly common across the country, particularly in the Atlantic Canadian provinces. But a bit of an affordability pitch from Kathleen Ganley. And actually, the people who are involved in the leadership race at this point have been talking about affordability a fair bit, whether that's increasing the exemption to income tax up to $26,000 from, I think it's about $21,000 or $22,000 currently. So this race has so far been a lot about affordability and healthcare, things like that, and perhaps not getting as much attention as one might have expected. But of course, it's budget season, and it's hard to compete with those big numbers.
So Tyler, Ganley, Pancholi, Hoffman all put their name in the hat to succeed Rachel Notley as leader of the Alberta NDP. What about some of the guys? Are they going to throw their names in the hat? People like Naheed Nenshi, the former Calgary mayor. How about David Shepherd, very popular MLA in Edmonton?
Yeah, those are certainly names that have been tossed around. There hasn't been a whole lot of indication that other people are jumping in just yet. In the case of Nenshi, the reports say that he's sort of exploring the idea, is looking at it, seeing what his supporters are. Of course, there's an amount of money that needs to be raised to enter the race. There's the approvals that he would need to get, in particular from the NDP leadership committee, because he's not actually a party member. David Shepherd, of course, does not have those barriers, let's say, but and he certainly was a name that was tossed around a lot. A lot of people expected him to enter the race, and he hasn't yet. Maybe he's waiting to see how things shake out. I think that's probably the case with Nenshi a little bit, just doing a little bit more explanation. But I should say, it would be a very interesting race if former Mayor Nenshi entered, because he's known Danielle Smith since their university days and has known her in her political life and in his political life and outside of that as well. So he would be a very, very fun guy to have in the leadership chair, I think, for the next election. If that,
the party may have to change its colors from orange to purple if Nenshi gets it.
They may, yeah.
Change the party name. We'll see. He's our political reporter, legislative correspondent, and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.
While many know about Jackie Robinson's experiences breaking Major League Baseball's color barrier back in 1947, few are familiar with the Chatham Colored All-Stars, a Black Canadian team from the 1930s which broke racial barriers in baseball even earlier. Joining us today to talk more about it is author of Sporting Justice and Associate Professor of History at the University of Windsor in Ontario, Miriam Wright. Miriam, welcome to Bridge City News.
No, thank you very much.
Now, what inspired you to research and write about the Chatham Colored All-Stars?
Well, it actually began by accident. I was department head at the time. This was about 2015, and we had decided to give out awards recognizing community history groups to sort of recognize the work that people on the ground were doing to promote history. And one of the groups that we gave an award to were in Chatham, Ontario. So we went down the road to Chatham to present this award. And while I was there, I spoke a little bit about the way that the way that websites have really sort of opened up the way that we can connect with the public. And a woman afterwards came up to me and said that her late father-in-law was named Wilfred Boomer Harding, was a member of this Black team, the Chatham Colored All-Stars, and she wondered if we could help make a website. And she said that they had these family scrapbooks just full of articles and photos and documents about this team and about sort of the athletic career of her late father-in-law. And she said it was stories were going to disappear. The public memory of this team was fading, and the number of people who were alive who could still remember them would soon pass away. And so I said, sure. And so I connected with my colleagues at the University of Windsor Library, Heidi Jacobs and Dave Johnson, and we decided to help make a website. So it began really as a public history project. We connected with the Chatham Sports Hall of Fame and the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society, and we made a website. We digitized the scrapbooks. And most importantly, we did oral histories. This was really important because we wanted to interview the family members of the players and get their perspectives on this story. And so we interviewed, we hired students, and so we launched this website finally 2017. And so it really kind of exploded. We didn't really sort of expect the response to be so big, and it's really taken on a life of its own in a lot of ways. The team got inducted into the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame in 2022. And so it's really been kind of exciting. And so writing the book was really, exploring the story a little bit more deeply, to sort of, we sort of began with the 1934 season. 1934 was so important because that was the year that they won a provincial championship, because sports was still largely segregated at that time by race, and Black teams had only recently been accepted into the white amateur baseball leagues. And the Chatham Colored All-Stars had formed in 1933, got accepted into the league. 1934, they won the provincial championship. And so the website really tells that story, but it's such a rich story, so much more involved with it. So I wrote a book. So it really sort of built upon that project.
So Miriam, can you share more details about the vibrant Black baseball network in southwestern Ontario and Michigan way back in the 1920s?
Oh, absolutely. This was done through family connections, because the Black population in Southern Ontario was very sort of cross-border. Many of them had family and relatives living on the other side. And so just started happening in the 1920s. There was a Black exhibition team in Chatham because they couldn't, they weren't playing any leagues. And so they would invite friends over. They invite teams that they knew, church league teams, and they bring them over to Chatham, and they would have these big sort of tournaments in Chatham, invite the wider population, and really kind of generated a big interest in Black baseball, even before the Chatham Colored All-Stars were formed.
So what unique challenges did the Chatham Colored All-Stars face in the primarily white world of organized amateur baseball? I suppose there was a lot of racism back then.
Absolutely. Just day-to-day racism they faced when they were playing. They experienced, people throwing rocks at them, hurling racial slurs at them. They would, when they traveled, it was difficult because they didn't know if they would be able to find a place to eat, whether a restaurant would serve them. They got turned away from hotels, even during their final championship tournament with the Penetanguishene team. And yeah, so this was a big barrier. Other barriers included like finances, money. They didn't have any major sponsors, and they had to scrounge to get people to help them even buy their uniforms. So they faced a lot of barriers that a white team wouldn't have faced.
And they overcame a lot of those barriers to win a provincial championship way back in 1934. Let's talk a bit about that with the Chatham Colored All-Stars.
Yeah, well, again, I think they surprised a lot of baseball observers. They were a team that were in many ways inexperienced. They were quite young. They, hadn't had to deal with all the bureaucracy and the politics of organized baseball, and they're getting a little bit of help from sponsors in Chatham who kind of knew the game and were connected and sort of helped shepherd them through. But yeah, they had to go through four tournaments. They played, Sarnia, Welland, Milton, and finally Penetanguishene. So it was a long series, and it was cold. I mean, by the time they finished, it was October and it was snowing. So it was it was kind of a long slog. Yeah.
So let me ask you something. Why did the team disband after only 8 years?
Well, I think partly they were aging out. They were by this point they were getting into their late 20s. A lot of them were married. Some of them had children, family responsibilities. The other thing was the war. It was 1940. Some of them joined up with the Canadian Armed Services. Others were employed in industry that required during the war. Industry needed workers, and so a lot of them were just tied up with their jobs, not able to leave the way that they had been when they were, less fully employed, let's say.
Did any of those players get drafted into Major League Baseball?
No, although one of the players who was actually not Black, who was actually Indigenous. He actually received a tryout with the Detroit Tigers in 1937. His name was Willie Shognosh. He was from Walpole Island. He was Ojibwe, and because the Black team used to play a lot of the local Indigenous teams a fair bit, and so that's how they got to know him. So they invited him onto the team in 1935, and he was a pitcher. In fact, he was considered one of the best pitchers in Southern Ontario, and so he played with the All-Stars for a number of years. 1937, he did get a tryout. We don't know what the result is. He remained playing in Southern Ontario, so obviously he didn't get drafted. But the fact that he was invited, suggests how good he was. Now, of course, the other team members wouldn't have had a chance, right? Because they were Black, the barriers were still there. There was no opportunity for them. But the one Indigenous man who was on the team did.
Was he a southpaw?
No, I believe he was a right-hander.
He was a righty. Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Was he a closer or a starter? Do you remember?
A starter. No, there were two. The other sort of major pitcher for the All-Stars was Earl Flat Chase. And he was a real legend because he was also the home run king. Like he was just
Wow.
a massive, massive player, and so he did both really well. And pitching and as a batter, but he often had a sore arm. So he had. I'm not sure when he had acquired it, but off and on. So he pitched whenever he could, but by 35. Willie Shognosh was doing a lot of the pitching.
And I bet you back then they didn't have a lot of pitch counts for their pitchers either. 75, 80, 100 pitches, that's too much. We got to take them out of the game. Back then,
Yeah.
they would start and try and finish the game. 150, 200 pitches, we're good to go.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Now this team also had a good number of pitchers. They actually had 4 or 5 because, people weren't as specialized. With baseball back then, they weren't as specialized. They were a lot more versatile. They would play, wherever they needed somebody, they would sort of fill in. And so there were actually 4 or 5 pitchers on that team. So that's another one of the strengths of the team is that they were because I think the game was or the series in 34 was ultimately won by pitching. And it's because they had this large group that were able to sort of, pitch in when things are rough.
So, Miriam, can you talk more about the new black teams that emerged in the 1940s and 50s?
Yes, yeah, and that's a good thing about this team is that they really played a role in supporting young black players because once they sort of established themselves, they were accepted. Like in the 40s, when the team broke up, many of them went on to white teams, but the younger generation was having a harder time, and so they had started by creating this like a junior team, in the late 30s, and then after the war was over, when they sort of came back and they regrouped. Former members of the team formed a new black team called the Taylor Athletic Club and brought in this whole slew of new players. Some of them, again, were quite good. In fact, one of them, A.B. Scott, played intercounty baseball in Brantford in the late 40s. And yeah, so that was sort of the beginning of it, and then it continued on into the 1950s. There's a team called the Chatham Panthers, and some of the Chatham called All Stars players were coaching, and a couple of the sons of the original Chatham called All Stars were playing on that team. So it was really it's really an intergenerational story. The teams from the team from the 20s is called the Giants. The Giants sort of ushered in the All Stars. The All Stars ushered in the Taylor AC and the Panthers. So it was it's a real intergenerational story that I think is really tells us a lot about the heart of the baseball culture in Chatham.
Is there any history, Miriam, of potentially Western Canadian ball players, whether Indigenous or Black, making their way to central Canada to also participate?
No, as you know, there is a strong tradition of Black baseball on the prairies, but I'm not aware of any connections with Southern Ontario. The only teams that they would play from away were, well, basically Southern Ontario. So London, Buxton, Chatham, Windsor, sort of that, and Detroit. That's sort of the network that they played in. I'm not aware of them playing with anyone outside of that.
So, how does the history of the Chatham Colored All Stars reflect larger themes in Canadian Black history?
Well, I think one of the most important things that it represents is the way that Black people were advocating for themselves. They were kind of resisting sort of the racist order of things, fighting for greater social and economic rights. Because the Gen Code All Stars were doing things that were mirrored in the community. There were other people in the community who were advocating for rights for Black people. It wasn't just them. It's part of this larger sort of fabric of activism. We often don't hear about very many of these stories. We might know about Viola Desmond, for example, but there were Viola Desmonds all over the place. And the Chatham Colored All Stars is sort of reflects the way that ordinary Black people, simply by standing up and saying, we deserve to be here, we're making a difference.
So, how do you think the Chatham Colored All Stars should be remembered today?
Well, I think that they should be remembered for the way that they stood up for themselves, the way that they moved into white sporting spaces, even though they paid a heavy price for that. I mean, that wasn't easy for them to do that, financially and psychologically. It was tough, but they did it. And they did it for the community. They gave back to the community, and they represented. They were role models for people that really needed to look to find people who would sort of point a way for them and who would be able to show them that another way of living is possible.
So, what impact do you hope your book will really have on readers' understanding of racial barriers in sport?
Well, one thing is I want them to realize that they were very real. I mean, I think it's in Canada, we sometimes like to think that, oh, we didn't have those kind of racial barriers. Jackie Robinson came to Montreal and he was well received. Well, the story is a lot more complicated than that. And I think it's important we realize that, racism was here, it was on the ground, it was in sports. But at the same time, people resisted it. Black people got, banded together and said, we're going to do things even though people are telling us that we shouldn't. And I think that's really important.
Are there any other little known stories of racial barrier breaking in sports that maybe you think should be told?
Well, yes, the women's, Black women's sports. There were Black women's softball teams in the same area in the same time period. 1920s, softball was very popular amongst young women, and so there were Black women's teams in Chatham and in Buxton and in London, and we're only just sort of hearing those stories. They've been in the community. People, certainly within the Black communities, people have always known about these stories, but it's only now, more recently, that their stories are, becoming more well known. That's I think a really important lead that should be followed.
Absolutely. Miriam Wright is the author of the book Sporting Justice and Associate Professor of History at the University of Windsor. Thanks so much for your time today.
Oh, thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and thanks for watching.